Jasper Ludwig stumbled home around 3 a.m. As usual, he had to give the dented metal door to his apartment a hard shove with his shoulder to open it. It squealed loudly on its hinges and Mrs. Burkowski next door instantly beat on the wall to grouchily demand silence. Although, her TV was blaring through the paper-thin walls. Did that old hag ever sleep? Jasper stumbled walking in the door over a stack of old advertisers and his work boots, on the floor just inside the door. He was sticky with sweat and still felt the adrenaline coursing through his veins from his band's gig at the local dive bar. The Dirty Riffs had put on a show of alright caliber, just like they did 3 nights a week. The last set had been a bit rough, since the rhythm guitarist drank too much and fell off the stage, but the crowd loved it. Jasper felt like he was on top of the world at that moment. That is until he saw him. A figure was standing in the middle of his living room, shrouded in darkness.
Who the heck are you?
Jasper demanded, his hand searching for something, anything, he could use as a weapon. The figure stepped forward into the light, and Jasper's jaw dropped. It was Jimi Hendrix. The legendary guitarist and singer, dead for over 50 years, was standing in his apartment. Jasper couldn't believe it. He had been a huge Hendrix fan for years, even modeling his guitar playing after him. This was a dream come true. The rocker stood dead center of Jasper's messy living room. He was slightly translucent and surrounded in a glimmering purple haze. He was not as tall as Jasper had always imagined, even though his feet hovered off the floor and he drifted in midair. On the wall behind Jimi was a giant poster of Jimi, and Jasper suddenly felt infinitely happy he'd chosen that particular decor. He was slightly embarrassed about the stink though. Could ghosts smell?
Groovy poster, my brother,
Jimi said in a gravelly voice, gesturing over his shoulder toward Jasper's living room artwork. Jasper was beaming. It felt like he might actually have a heart attack. He was only 23, so he'd never felt like having a heart attack. But he was pretty sure it might happen right then. Oh well, then he could be a ghost with Jimi freaking Hendrix.
Bro, what are you doing here?
Jasper shouted. Mrs. Burkowski next door delivered 3 hard slams to the wall, but Jasper barely noticed. Before he even thought twice, he rushed forward to embrace the dead rock star. And, he fell right through the specter. Jimi Hendrix burst into hysterical tears. Alarmed, Jasper cajoled the bedraggled ghost into the nearest seat, which was a tattered and rather disgusting armchair. An ashtray on the arm of the chair brushed off onto the floor when Jimi whooshed down into the seat. It broke on the concrete floor and ashes spread everywhere, but Jasper barely noticed.
I'm sorry, man.
Jimi blubbered.
I can't do hugs anymore and it kinda bums me out, you know?
The phantom wept bitterly and glowing snot spread across his face.
That's okay, buddy.
Jasper insisted.
My feelings have been so big since I died, my man.
Jimi went on.
It's strange.
It didn't take long to get Jimi calmed down and ready to chat. Luckily, Jasper didn't have to work his day job in the morning because it was Friday night. So, he could afford to stay up a little longer. Good thing, because Jimi Hendrix had a lot to say. He talked about how to haunt a music venue properly so that you could sort out the sound system. He told stories of how he and Elvis sometimes enjoyed haunting the same places and pranking living rockers. It turns out, he was even a conspiracy theorist who claimed the moon landing was fake, even though it had happened only months before Hendrix died. One thing he didn't ever explain was why he had turned up there in Jasper's dump of an apartment. The sun was beginning to come up and Jasper could hear birds twerping outside when his eyes drooped heavily and his head started nodding. He finally had to interrupt Jimi in the middle of a story about having beers with Waylon Jennings.
Buddy, I'm so sorry, but I gotta crash out, I'm beat.
Jimi laughed, a low rich chortle.
Right on, man, right on. I always forget you livers have to sleep. No problem, go ahead and hit the sack. I'll make myself at home.
Jasper fell into his messy bed with barely enough energy left to pull his blanket over him. He was still shocked to be in the presence of such greatness. And apparently, he was going to stick around. How could he have gotten so lucky? 2 hours later, he didn't feel quite as lucky. He was sleeping like a baby and then, bam! Yanked from peaceful slumber by none other than Jimi Hendrix, who'd plugged in Jasper's guitar and began to shred the Star-Spangled Banner loudly. And of course, Mrs. Burkowski, not only violently beating on the wall but also screaming obscenities. Imagine telling Jimi Hendrix to pipe down. Who does that? Mrs. Burkowski was so incredibly embarrassing. Jasper found his legs and stumbled to the living room. He noted that Jimi had apparently had some drinks as a brigade of empty bottles were scattered at his feet around the chair and a cigarette smoldered in the same ashtray he'd earlier spilled but had now refilled with fresh butts.
Jimi! Jimi! Jimi!
Jasper said, motioning downward with his hands.
So sorry, buddy, but I gotta ask you to turn it off. My neighbor is a grump. Not to mention, I'm still pretty tired.
Jimi laughed, scooped up 2 beers and clinked them together, offering himself a cheers.
Apologies, my brother. I forgot.
He stood up, carefully placing Jasper's guitar into the chair and coming to clap Jasper on the shoulder. Of course, his hand phased through Jasper and Jimi burst into tears again. Jasper sighed, and spent the next half hour trying to console Jimi while Mrs. Burkowski beat the wall. Weird how Jimi couldn't touch people but he could play guitar and drink beer. Being a ghost seemed fairly cool to Jasper. Soon he was back in bed. But then soon after that, Jimi was waking him up again. Hendrix wanted to ask Jasper if he and the other members of Dirty Riffs ever played pranks. Because he was really trying to think of something good to get that Justin Bieber kid with. Jasper was slightly less understanding about being awoken that time. As the days began to pass, Jasper realized that having a ghost in his apartment wasn't all it was cracked up to be. For one thing, Hendrix was messy. Like, even messier than Jasper, who was already pretty messy. Jimi left cigarette butts and empty beer bottles everywhere, and his ghostly form seemed to attract dust and grime like a magnet. No wonder his purple glow was so hazy. Worse than that, though, Hendrix was needy. He constantly wanted Jasper's attention, and would follow him around the apartment, trying to engage him in conversation.
I remember when I wrote Purple Haze.
Hendrix said, wistfully.
Those were the days, man.
Jasper nodded politely, but he was starting to get annoyed. He had a day job to go to on some mornings, and he needed his sleep. But Hendrix seemed to have no concept of personal boundaries, and he kept talking and talking. To make matters worse, Hendrix was a crier. He would burst into tears at the slightest provocation, whether it was a sad song on the radio or a particularly poignant memory from his past. At one point, Jasper thought it'd be cool to strum a cover of one of Jimi's songs. But, apparently his rendition wasn't up to snuff because Hendrix cried over it. Once Jasper accidentally kicked over one of Jimi's beers, and that made him cry. Jimi sobbed hysterically once because Jasper chose to watch Beverly Hills 90210 instead of old clips of Jimi. One morning, Jimi discovered a thinning patch in his epic fro, and of course, he dissolved into hysterics. Who knew ghosts were so dang emotional? Jasper tried to be patient, but eventually, he couldn't take it anymore. He confronted Hendrix one night, telling him that he needed to move on to the afterlife. Hendrix was devastated.
But I don't want to go, man.
He wailed.
This world is so much cooler than the afterlife. Can I just stay here with you?
Jasper sighed, feeling a twinge of sympathy for the ghost. After all, what kind of guitar player would really kick Jimi freaking Hendrix out of their apartment? If the Dirty Riffs only knew. They'd probably kick him out of the band. But he knew he couldn't continue living like this. He needed his space, and he needed his sanity. Plus the stink of his apartment had exceeded even his tolerance levels.
I'll tell you what.
Jasper said, after a moment's thought.
I'll let you possess me for one night, and you can play a show. But after that you have to go into the light. Agreed?
Hendrix's face lit up with a ghostly smile.
Really?
He murmured, his eyes glimmering with tears. Jasper sighed.
Now Jimmy, no need to cry. It'll be all right.
Jimmy pursed his lips and nodded rapidly, but then he made the noise that had become familiar, the little whimper that started deep in his throat and then erupted into a full-blown wail of uncontrollable emotion. Jasper groaned and scrambled to comfort the dramatic haunt, but couldn't quiet him quickly enough to keep Mrs. Burkowski from losing her ever-loving mind. The night of the show arrived. Even though it was just another show at the old dive, Boozy Blues, with his familiar band mates of Dirty Riffs, it felt like he was taking the stage of Madison Square Garden. Jasper strode into the limelight with long lazy strides. He could feel Hendrix's presence inside him. The colorful lights came up and Jasper/Jimmy drove his fingers down across the strings, shredding the performance to life. Jimmy guided Jasper's fingers across the fretboard of his guitar. Energy sizzled amongst the members of the Dirty Riffs. Jasper's sudden burst of super talent inspired the band mates and they jammed like they'd never jammed before. The happy drunk patrons of Boozy Blues went absolutely wild, never having any idea that they were listening to Jimi freaking Hendrix deliver his last performance before crossing over into the light. But then something strange started to happen. Jasper could feel Hendrix's personality taking over, and he knew that he was no longer in control. Hendrix was using his body to play his music, and he was doing it better than Jasper ever could. Jasper tried to fight back, but it was like he was trapped inside his own mind, watching as Hendrix performed to a cheering crowd. It was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. Finally, the show was over, and Hendrix released his grip on Jasper's body. Jasper stumbled off stage, feeling drained and disoriented. Also his face was covered with tears, because Jimmy had of course been crying. However, the tears probably blended with the sweat, so maybe no one noticed. A sense of peace and closure settled over Jasper in the shadows backstage after the show. Jasper collapsed into a nearby chair, feeling the weight of the experience he just had. He was still processing what had happened and what it all meant. He had helped Hendrix move on to the afterlife. Somehow he knew it even though Jimmy didn't say goodbye. Suddenly, he felt a strange sensation, like a cool breeze blowing through the room. He looked up and saw that Hendrix's ghostly figure was starting to fade away.
Is it time?
Jasper asked, feeling a lump form in his throat. Hendrix smiled at him.
Yeah, man. It's time for me to go. Thanks for everything.
Jasper nodded, feeling a mix of sadness and relief. He had enjoyed having Hendrix around, but he knew that it was time for him to move on. As Hendrix's ghostly figure disappeared completely, Jasper was left alone in the room, feeling a strange sense of emptiness. He realized that he had gotten used to having the legendary guitarist around, and that he would miss him. But he also knew that he had learned a valuable lesson. He had come to understand that even the people we idolize are just people, with flaws and quirks and messy lives. And sometimes, we have to let them go. Jasper picked up his guitar and started to play, feeling a newfound sense of purpose and direction. He knew that he still had a long way to go, but he was ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. As he played, he felt a sense of peace settle over him, like he was tapping into something bigger than himself. He knew that Hendrix would always be with him, in some way, and that he had been lucky to have had the chance to meet him, even if it was in the form of a ghost. And so, Jasper continued to play, pouring his heart and soul into his music, knowing that he was honoring the legacy of one of the greatest musicians of all time. 6 months later, after another killer show with the Dirty Riffs, a man in a suit approached Jasper. The mysterious guy extracted a business card from inside his suit jacket and handed it to Jasper.
I'm Eric Masterson.
The man said in a somewhat annoying vocal fry.
Call me
he added just before spinning on his heel and making his way back through the crowd of the dark and grimy bar. Jasper looked down at the card and saw that Eric Masterson was from Sony Music Entertainment. He almost peed his pants.
No way.
He whispered.
No way!
Jasper looked up toward the ceiling and whispered a quiet thanks to his legendary hero and friend, Jimi Hendrix. He was so happy, he almost felt like he might cry.